You know, friends, there are moments in life when you feel like something is dragging you down, straight into the abyss, and all you can do is cling to fragments of hope to avoid falling. That's exactly how I felt when I started realizing that my wife, the woman with whom I had shared both joys and hardships for so many years, was playing a completely different game. That realization came slowly, like a sharp, cold wind, which at first felt like a gentle breeze but then suddenly chilled me to the bone. At first, it was just little things. You know, those barely perceptible hints that you start noticing by accident, like the fact that she suddenly began staying late at work more often. At that time, I didn't worry too much. Work was work, after all, and everyone has their own responsibilities. But with each instance of coming home late, it became more frequent, and her explanations grew increasingly vague. At that point, I probably should have asked myself why this didn't alarm me, why I didn't start digging deeper. I was just a fool, a blind, lovesick fool. But regardless, I always believed that real problems could be solved together, that trust could hold out somewhere deep inside. Then, one day, that calm breeze turned into a storm. The turning point, as I call it, happened when I came home earlier than usual. She hadn't expected me to find her at home, certain that I had an important meeting that would definitely run late. I came back and heard her talking to someone on the phone. Her words cut through my peace like knives. It wasn't just a work call, it was something much more personal. Her voice, her tone, the way she laughed, it wasn't the kind of laughter she shared with me. At that moment, I realized that she was living a double life. My heart clenched, but I stood silently and listened. She finished the call without even noticing me there. That night, I understood that it was time to end this game. I didn't make a scene, I didn't scream or hurl insults. I simply decided to think everything through. And finally, when everything became clear in my mind, I filed for divorce. At first, I thought it wouldn't be easy, that there would be pain, disappointment, maybe even tears. But it turned out to be much worse. The threats began. When she found out that I wanted to divide our property, she became a different person. It was as if a mask had fallen, and in front of me stood someone completely different. She told me outright, "If you try to divide what's ours, you will regret it." And it wasn't an empty warning. No, she knew exactly what she was saying, and I understood that this woman was ready to do whatever it took to come out of this situation victorious. My astonishment knew no bounds. Where did that hardness in her come from? We had been together for so many years. What was it? Love? Or just an agreement where she always wanted more? Well, friends, you're probably thinking that this was the end of my story, but it turned out to be only the beginning. If the first blows I received from her were painful, what happened next turned my life into a true ordeal. I filed for divorce, thinking that the court would rule fairly between us. After all, we had lived together for many years, and what we had built was the result of our joint efforts, wasn't it? But how wrong I was. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. I filed the papers, and we scheduled a hearing. But something went wrong from the very first session. The judge's decisions were simply absurd. It was as if everything was my fault, and according to him, I had no right to the property we had earned together. As I began searching for the truth, I discovered something that changed my view of life. It turned out that my ex-wife had taken the easy way out. Together with her new lover, they had found a way to influence the judge handling our case. As it turns out, in this world, everything can be bought and sold, especially if someone has extra financial resources. You know, the money I had earned for years to support our family, our home, our future, was now being used to turn everything against me. Quite the ironic twist, wouldn't you say? At each hearing, I tried to defend myself, to prove that this was shared property, but the judge looked at me as if I were nobody. She, meanwhile, sat across from me with her new partner, accusing me of every misfortune she could think of. And every time she looked at me, there was a smile on her face. A satisfied, self-assured smile, as if she had already won this battle, even without beginning it. For a long time, I couldn't believe things were going this way. I thought, this is some kind of misunderstanding, I'll be able to prove my truth. But the judge's decisions continued to go against me, one after another. First, it was the property. The house we had built together over the years was transferred to her name. Then the accounts. I'll be honest, all our savings were there, which I had considered a safe haven for times of crisis. But, as it turned out, that was now her personal contribution, and all that was left for me were debts. Then, as if to finally crush me, the court ruled that all the loans we had taken together would remain my responsibility. So, from the heights of hope where my faith in justice had lifted me, I fell like a stone, without any support. I was left without a single cent, with debts hanging over me like a sword, and with the feeling that my life had crumbled. And the worst part was that I couldn't even stop it. The last hearing left me with only one thing: emptiness. I stood before the judge, who had effectively signed my bankruptcy order, while she sat across from me, self-satisfied, confident in her victory, alongside her companion, whom I hated with every fiber of my being. Now, they had everything: the house, the money, even what we had once called our shared future. And I was left with debts and empty pockets. The feeling was as if I had become a beggar in my own life. Every item, every small thing in our house reminded me of how much I had lost, of how I had been used. At first, it felt like a dream, a nightmare from which I was about to wake. But no, this was reality, and even worse, I was alone in it. So, when I left that courtroom, there was only one enormous chaos in my mind. Everything that once seemed stable and certain had collapsed before my eyes. I was left alone with empty pockets and debts that weighed like stones. In those first days, I felt as if I had been cast out of my own life. I used to be unable to imagine myself without a roof over my head, and now I didn't know where to find even a single coin for food. I had to sleep wherever I could find any kind of shelter. I slept on benches, in abandoned buildings, and sometimes simply under the open sky. Those days were a true ordeal. The winter was harsh, and every night felt like a battle for survival. People passed by me without looking me in the eye, as if I were just a shadow worth nothing. And you know what keeps you afloat in such moments? Anger. That cold, sharp, piercing anger that constantly reminded me of how I had been deceived, stripped of everything. I thought about her, the one who once promised to love me, to be there for me in both joy and sorrow, who ultimately turned my life to ruins. And I thought about him, this night, who intruded into my home and destroyed everything I had built. Each time hunger drove me to search for even a crumb of food, there was only one thought in my mind: I must take revenge. That desire, that need to show them that they couldn't just treat me this way, became the only purpose of my existence. Everything I did, every day I lived, was infused with that thought. I would see her and him occasionally. Once, they walked past me in the city center, holding hands, dressed in expensive clothes, with smiles on their faces. For them, it was a celebration, a new life they had started afresh. For me, it was another blow to the heart. They didn't even recognize me, or maybe they just ignored someone who had lost all value. In that moment, I felt even more like a beggar in my own city, in my former life, which now belonged to them. Sometimes old acquaintances approached me, trying to sympathize, but their looks revealed everything. They didn't feel compassion, they looked at me with contempt, as if I was responsible for my situation. Every one of those encounters only added fuel to the fire. I would hear them whispering to each other, suggesting that I had it coming, that I probably deserved what happened. Those looks, those whispers, ate me up inside. I realized there was no point in justifying myself to them, they had already made up their minds. And that only drove me further. The anger I carried inside became, essentially, my only friend, the only force preventing me from completely falling. Every time I thought there was nowhere else to go, I would remember her smile, his smug look, and it would reignite my will to keep going. But not just to keep going, to get revenge. There were nights when I literally couldn't sleep, turning over in my mind how I would make them pay. I imagined every detail, every step. At first, I was consumed by rage, but then I started planning. It wasn't a quick or impulsive reaction. No, over time, everything became cold and clear, like a blueprint. I wanted to take back not only my money and status but also my sense of dignity, which they had stripped from me. I understood that I would have to start from scratch. But now, starting from scratch didn't scare me anymore. I was willing to become anyone, to do whatever it took, just to stand up again. So, when it became clear that help was coming from nowhere and hunger started knocking on my door each morning, I decided to find a job. Imagine, just a year ago, I had everything, I was a person with status and dignity, and now I stood at the gates of a farm, asking for any job. The main thing was to find a way to earn at least a few coins, if only for food. But it was easier said than done. I admit, even the most optimistic people would hesitate to hire a beggar from whom desperation seemed to seep out like a cold chill. I was turned down everywhere, they just looked at me as if I were a dangerous creature. Finally, after countless attempts, I found a farmer who decided to give me a chance. He met me with distrust, and I understood. All he saw before him was a person without a penny to his name, dressed in tattered rags, with a look that probably inspired nothing but caution. He looked at me as though I was ready to steal at any moment. But no, I was there to work honestly, even if it meant humbling myself for a few coins in exchange for hard labor. I took the job of a cleaner on the farm. The work wasn't easy, but at that time, I didn't care. I clung to any chance to stay afloat. I worked from dawn till dusk, feeling my body grow weaker each day from constant exhaustion, but I held on. After a few days, I managed to save enough to buy food, so at least I wasn't going hungry anymore. However, it didn't take long before she found out. Whether by accident or on purpose, someone told her about my new job. One would think that by now she wouldn't care, we were divorced, she was happy with her new life, and she had everything she wanted. But it seemed that the pleasure of seeing me suffer was sweeter to her than anything else. As soon as she learned about my new place of work, a real nightmare began. The next day, when I arrived at the farm, the farmer was already waiting for me with a stony expression on his face. He started telling me that he couldn't keep me any longer, that I was a useless worker, that problems had arisen. I immediately understood what was going on. It turned out that my ex-wife had called the farmer and started telling him terrible things about me. She claimed I was a potential thief, that I was being sued over debts, that I was a danger to his business. She even hinted that he might lose customers and his reputation because of me. Her words were pure poison, and as I could see, she was truly willing to do whatever it took to get me thrown out of there. The farmer didn't want to hear any explanations. For him, my past was reason enough to sever any association with me. I didn't beg or try to justify myself. I knew it wouldn't help. I stood at the gates of the farm, once again having lost the only thing I had, the hope of a normal life. As I walked away from the farm, anger and despair filled me. I had been left without a roof over my head, without work, without support, and even the single chance to earn a scrap of food was destroyed by her hatred. I looked at the road ahead and wondered how much longer I could survive like this. But the anger, that burning anger that she continued to stoke with her actions, didn't allow me to fall completely. I felt that this anger was the only thing keeping me moving forward. Once again, jobless and without any means to live, I knew she wouldn't just leave me alone. Her plan was simple and cruel, to push me down even further until I would disappear from her life forever. Sometimes it feels like fate throws us into the deepest pit to see if we can climb out. That's exactly how I felt at that moment, as though I was at the very bottom, surrounded only by darkness and cold. But then, something happened that I hadn't expected. Along my path, I encountered an old friend I hadn't seen since school. We had both grown up and taken different roads in life, but he recognized me, approached, and started talking. It turned out that he was doing quite well, running a small business, and when I told him my story, he was probably the only one who could understand what I had gone through. My friend didn't ask unnecessary questions or look at me like I was a failure. Instead, he listened, thought for a while, and told me he could help me get a job with a friend of his. The only condition was that he would be responsible for me, and if I let him down, I would also let him down. That was the moment I realized that I still had people who believed in me, even if I had started to lose faith myself. My friend's friend turned out to be someone who needed hard-working hands and valued dedication. He listened to me, weighed the pros and cons, and finally agreed to take me on a trial basis. Even though the work wasn't well paid and required a lot of effort, for me, it was like a breath of fresh air after those endless days of hopelessness. I was ready to work from morning till night, just to earn something and not depend on anyone. Gradually, as I worked for this new employer, I began to earn at least a little money. At first, it was just enough to buy food and rent a small room. But each coin I earned was a symbol of my rebirth, a sign that I could rise again. And every time things got tough, I thought of my ex-wife and how she had tried to destroy me. That thought gave me the strength to get up every morning and work with all my energy. Over time, I learned to manage my expenses and even started to save a bit. It was just the beginning, but for me, it meant that I could again make choices and have an impact on my life. And maybe, in those moments of newfound stability, I found my true motivation. I realized I wanted more, that I no longer wanted to depend on someone else's job or goodwill. I decided that someday I would become my own boss and regain the dignity that had been taken from me. Yes, back then, it seemed like a distant dream, a vague idea, but as they say, every great journey begins with a single step. I started watching closely how my employer ran his business, studying every detail, observing which processes brought him profit and which caused losses. I wasn't ashamed to ask questions, and over time, my boss began to see more in me than just an ordinary worker. He even started sharing some of his business secrets with me. Through daily work, I gradually developed my own strategy. I thought about how to start my own business, in which areas I could take risks, and what I would need to achieve it. Of course, starting out with no money wasn't easy, but I set myself the goal of saving up for a startup fund. And every time I set aside even a small amount, only one thought ran through my head: this is my way back, my path to my own triumph. Now I had a plan, a strategy that gave purpose to my actions. Years passed, and my persistence began to pay off. What once seemed like an unreachable dream gradually became a reality. My business started to flourish, and with time, I wasn't just making a living, I was able to afford more than I had ever imagined. The company I had built step by step became a success and gave back everything I had lost when I was at rock bottom. But this time, it was different. It was my business, my success, and no one could take it away from me. I began to feel confident in myself again, and I regained the dignity that had been so cruelly taken from me. Each morning, I woke up with a sense of moving in the right direction, and that feeling kept me going. Yet, even though everything was going well, there was still a but that wouldn't let me find complete peace. The memory of that betrayal and the humiliations remained deeply rooted in my heart. Sometimes, especially during moments when my business demanded my full attention, that thought would resurface: how could it be that those people, who had stripped me of everything, had gone unpunished? It wasn't that I was obsessed with revenge. No, I no longer dreamed of petty retribution or hurting them in return. But I also couldn't just let it go and pretend as if nothing had happened. Every time I remembered how they left me out on the street, how she and her lover celebrated while I was left homeless, I felt a surge of anger. It wasn't a desire for revenge, it was a deep longing for justice. After many sleepless nights, I decided that the time had come to take action. Now that I had more resources, I could afford to hire people who would help me find all the documents and facts that would hold them accountable. I began working with lawyers, financial consultants, and even private detectives who could shed light on details that had gone unnoticed in those years when I was deceived. I knew this wouldn't be an easy path, but I had a plan. I now had not only money but also connections, people who were willing to help me in my quest for justice. Each small success in this investigation was like a breath of fresh air. It turned out that my ex-wife and her new lover were not as innocent as they had appeared. Interesting details came to light: document forgery, bribes to the judge, even fraudulent schemes they were both involved in. With each new piece of information we uncovered, I felt justice drawing closer. This was not revenge, it was a real fight to ensure that their actions didn't go unpunished. I acted coldly and calculatedly. Every step was carefully thought out because now I knew how important it was to stick to a strategy. I was ready to go all the way to make them answer for everything they had done to me. Sooner or later, as the saying goes, all secrets come to light. When my team and I gathered all the evidence, I knew that my ex-wife, her lover, and the corrupt judge wouldn't escape justice. My case gained momentum, and eventually, I filed a lawsuit demanding the return of everything they had taken from me illegally. Now I had the strength, the resources, and the conviction to defend myself, and I felt that, for the first time in a long time, the truth was on my side. When the trial began, I saw her in the courtroom, the woman who once stood by my side, who had promised to be with me in good times and bad. Her face no longer held the confidence it once did. She was no longer the woman who had smiled across from me during our divorce. Her lover, it turned out, was also in deep trouble. All his connections, all his tricks no longer worked, because this time he faced facts from which there was no escape. First, the judge was convicted, the very one who had once helped ruin my life. For all his manipulations and bribes, he received a prison sentence. That was the first moment when I felt that justice was finally prevailing. Next came her lover's turn. He too was investigated for his involvement in fraud and his complicity in their conspiracy. His life and career crumbled like a house of cards. Finally, the time came for my ex-wife to be held accountable. All the evidence of bribery and her involvement in the conspiracy was now laid bare. The court issued a verdict, and she had to answer for her actions. She received a prison sentence for bribery and fraud. It was strange to see someone who had once clung to money and power now lose everything, finding herself in the same desperation in which she had once left me. But the most important part was that the court ordered the return of a portion of the property that had been taken from me illegally. I won back a significant part of what we had earned together and what was rightfully mine. This money and property were not just material possessions for me. They were symbols of restored justice, a sign that it was possible to defend oneself, even when all seems lost. And so, as I stood at the threshold of my new life, I felt that I had finally completed that long and difficult journey. This was not revenge, it was the recovery of what was rightfully mine. My story became a testament to me that justice exists, even if it sometimes takes a long time to come. After all the court proceedings, after justice had finally prevailed, I felt something entirely new, relief. The weight of the past, which had pressed on my shoulders for years, seemed to dissolve into the air. Now that all that dirty history was behind me, I could finally think about the future. My life began to change. Financially, I was back on track, my business was thriving, and I had regained a portion of the property and money that had once been taken from me. But the biggest change was my attitude toward life. I was no longer the man who believed in sweet promises, no longer the naive young man who saw the world through rose-colored glasses. My story taught me to value real things, to understand who truly stands by your side. And then, when I wasn't even looking for something new, she appeared in my life, a woman who managed to melt the ice around my heart. She was a completely different person, unlike the one I had once called my wife. She was sincere, open, with a positive outlook on life, and dreams of her own that she pursued with as much passion as I did. She didn't try to impress me with promises or a charming facade, she was simply herself, and that was the most important thing to me. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully, without haste. For the first time in my life, I began to trust someone, not to forget my past, but because I felt a genuine connection, a deep affection. She knew my story, she knew everything I had been through, and she didn't look at me with pity or reproach. To her, I was the person standing before her now, not the one who had suffered so much loss. Eventually, we got married, and it was a completely different feeling from before. It wasn't just a formality or a symbol of status. It was a union built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. And you know, for the first time in a long time, I began to truly enjoy life. We traveled together, made plans, laughed, and lived each day, appreciating every moment. With her by my side, I realized that I had finally found what I had longed for so deeply. She gave me peace, hope, and the feeling that I could be happy again. Sometimes, as we sat together in the evenings, we would talk about the past, but these conversations no longer sparked anger or regret. Now I looked at my life as a journey that had led me to this moment, to her, to the life I had always wanted. It was a hard, thorny path, but when I look at my new wife, my successful business, my home, I understand that it was all worth it. I have regained my dignity, found justice, and now I have everything that makes me happy. And perhaps that's the best kind of revenge one could imagine, not hatred or anger, but simple human happiness. But before I end, I want to apologize. You see, I'm not a native speaker, so there may be some mistakes in the text. I use artificial intelligence to help convey my thoughts, but I'm still learning the language and trying to improve every day. I hope you understand, and I thank you for listening until the end.